Hello again, I'm Linas Kojala and we return to Conversations on Democracy. Another topic to discuss is the resilience of democracies in the face of deglobalization and radical populism. And for that we have two other excellent speakers and I would like to introduce them now. First of all, Mr. Christopher Walker. He's Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. He's an expert on authoritarian regimes. He is a co-editor of the edited volume Authoritarianism Goes Global, The Challenge to Democracy, and co-editor of the report Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence, which was published by the National Endowment for Democracy in 2017. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and elsewhere. Welcome. And we also have Dr. Anton Shekhovtsov. He's director of the Center for Democratic Integrity in Austria. He is a senior fellow at the Free Russia Foundation in the United States. He also authored books, Russian language book, New Radical Right-Wing Parties in European Democracies in 2011, as well as the book Russia and the Western Far Right, Tango Noir, which was published in 2017. He also publishes in various international media outlets his op-eds, as well as academic articles. So welcome and thank you for being with us today. I would like to maybe ask first Mr. Christopher Walker about the sharp power. What does that mean? What does the concept mean in today's world?
Well, it's great to be here with you today. And in short order, what I would say is that the typical framing for the exertion of influence internationally in domains such as media or cultural sphere has been soft power. And I think in this era of hyper-globalization with authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia exerting more influence in those very domains, in the media sphere, the cultural sphere, through their own policy institutes, my colleagues and I, through our research, found that in more instances than not, that sort of power and influence was not attracting and persuading. It wasn't always looking to win hearts and minds in the way the conception of this influence under the soft power rubric had been thought of for the last several decades. And hence we thought it would be useful for the purposes of the discussion today to raise some questions about that conventional framing. Sharp power in so many instances has to do with censorship, in either setting certain topics off limit, questioning the ability of voices to participate in discussions, or otherwise neutralizing independent institutions and thought. And so at root, that's really what we found when we looked at these forms of influence that didn't have the characteristics of attraction and persuasion and winning hearts and minds.
Does democracy get more and more vulnerable to sharp power coming from authoritarian regimes, from Russia to China, as well as other ones?
I think what we're seeing today in so many respects, precisely because free societies are open, and for many years now we've been integrating and engaging with authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, that we haven't been prepared for the sorts of intrusions and the sorts of manipulations that have become so evident over the course, certainly, of the last decade, that we're all experiencing. And I think it's very important to point out that open societies everywhere, whether it's in Europe, North America, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, are grappling with similar problems. They're not always identical, but these intrusions into processes that used to be more contained, the election process, the media process, is something that's different today in this freewheeling, globalized world we're operating in.
Dr. Shekhovtsov, you've been working on radical populism for years. This is probably one of the ways of influencing also democratic systems from outside. So how do you see the most recent developments? Are you worried about the rise of radical populism?
I was working, and well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I was working on radical right-wing populism. What we see now is that in very few instances we are really talking about left-wing populism in Europe. It's mostly right-wing populism. And here I would like to comment first on the term populism. Sometimes it gets really demonized in the media and in the political sphere, but populism, first of all, is the language of dividing the society into two parts. One part is so-called corrupt elites, and the second part is the so-called ordinary people. So this language is used almost by all politicians who are in the opposition, because they pretend, all the opposition politicians, they pretend to defend these ordinary people from the corrupt, so-called corrupt elites. With right-wing populism, with radical right-wing populism, in the recent years, what I noticed is that there are two different perspectives, or there are two different directions how radical right-wing populism develops. One direction is the mainstreamization, and in some ways attempts to make radical right-wing populism more respectable, because they understand that people or societies, they don't really vote for extremists. With some very few exceptions, if politicians want to come to power, and if they are coming from this radical right-wing populist movement, they need to get more, become more mainstream, to become more respectable in order to, for example, join a coalition. And we've seen several times that far-right politicians realized that they would not be able to secure political support or social support in order to govern alone. So they need to have coalition partners. And in order to have coalition partners, say, for example, from the center-right, from the conservative forces, small c conservative forces, they need to de-radicalize. So this is one direction where radical right-wing populism is going today, with some exceptions. There is another development, and we've seen this development, for example, in Greece, where really extremist parties such as the Golden Dawn was in the parliament, it was voted in the parliament, but it failed to de-radicalize, to become more mainstream, and it was, in the end, it was banned in Greece. And we see similar examples across Europe. So these are two developments, and I believe that radical right-wing populism as such, it's not threatening the foundations of liberal democracy. And even if radical right-wing populists come to power, if the institutions are strong in a particular society, they can be voted out of power if they cannot change the foundations of democracy. So I would not exaggerate the threat of radical right-wing populism as such. What is more important, I guess, is not to look at this as a threat, but to consider the trust in institutions as the more important thing to worry about. Because I think a classical example would be the rise of the Nazis in Germany in the 20th century. It happened not because the Nazi party was so strong, it's because the institutions of Weimar Germany were very, very weak. This is how this takeover, the Nazi takeover, took place, because of the weakness of democratic institutions.
This is a very good point, probably also in today's circumstances, and I would like to maybe return to Mr. Walker. Do you see a trend where authoritarian regimes present themselves as being more effective, especially in comparison to democratic countries which have institutional troubles, which have troubles dealing with the pandemic, which have multiple geopolitical challenges, which face new kind of informational landscape with social media rise and etc. So then the authoritarian regimes try to present themselves as an alternative, better, more effective model. Is that the case?
So I think many authoritarian regimes are presenting themselves as more effective, but I doubt whether it's true. They have the ability to present themselves in this way because they control the media typically and don't permit alternatives. They control politics and don't have opposition that can question these things in a systematic way. And hence the dominant powers in these countries, whether we're talking about China or Russia can do exactly that. I think if you scratch below the surface and you look at the ways in which many of these countries are handling the pandemic, it's not as good as the leading authorities who have unchecked power are presenting it. I think democracy has always been a challenging system to maintain. It's a messy process. There's competition. The stakes are high. It's the nature of the beast. I think what we're dealing with today is very relevant to what Anton just alluded to, which is the declining trust in institutions in democracies of all types by the populations. There are a lot of reasons that can explain this. Some of it has to do with the changing nature of gatekeepers in our societies, the fact that our media systems have changed so profoundly. Mass opinion formation is dramatically different today than it was even 10 years ago. These sorts of things surely are raising challenges for our societies. At the same time, democratic societies have the potential and the track record of self-correcting, which I think is part of what we're seeing now. Part this is stimulated by the challenges that have emerged in the recent past. But I would put my money and my beliefs on free societies to rally to these challenges in ways that over time authoritarian regimes have proven not so equipped to do.
Yeah, would you like that?
I completely agree with Christopher, and I would like to give you a few examples about authoritarian regimes being not really efficient. Take, for example, the year 2020, spring, the beginning of the pandemic, and Russia and China sent humanitarian aid to Italy and Serbia. Both Chinese and the Kremlin propaganda pictured this humanitarian aid, or put this into perspective, saying the EU does not help Italy or Serbia, NATO does not help Italy, only we are helping. But in the end, this help, especially coming from Russia, was not that efficient or important for those countries. And in the end, well, these countries, these regimes, they were faster in supplying humanitarian aid. Of course, they had their own business and economic interests in those countries. This is why they did this. And of course, for Russia, it was very important to show that NATO allegedly is not working well, in helping fight the pandemic. But in the end, the EU and other Western countries, they gave more humanitarian aid, both to Italy and Serbia, than China and Russia. So they were really fast, because with authoritarian regimes, the decision-making is extremely fast. You don't need a bureaucratic process. You don't need a democratic process of, debate. They were fast. But in the end, those were Western countries that delivered much more to the countries in need. And I just want to add about authoritarian regimes, the model that they are offering, I would call it, they are trying to sell other countries the idea of authoritarian stability. They are offering, well, they're saying, well, we may be corrupt, but we are offering you this authoritarian stability. If you look at the regimes that Russia, for example, Putin Russia supports, when it is saying that it opposes coup d'etats or so-called color revolutions, but they would support military juntas, for example. So they are against popular uprisings. They are against societies trying to reform or oppose authoritarian regimes. But they're quite okay with coup d'etats that were produced by the military, for example. So you have this understanding that they are trying to sell this model of authoritarian stability, but in the end, this is a fake product. You cannot keep this forever, and what they're offering is just it's scam.
I might just add
Yep,
one short point to build on what Anton just alluded to in terms of how people perceive the assistance coming from countries like Russia and China. The scholar Peter Kreko has done some really interesting work on a country like Serbia, where, as Anton noted, the amount of aid coming from China and Russia is actually quite small compared to the European Union, but the perception in media terms, the public perception, is actually that Russia and China have provided more in certain cases. And I think that does raise some questions in open societies and the way in which we communicate to make sure that the kind of reality of support and assistance is aligned with the perceptions. I think the authoritarians, at least to a degree, have figured out the importance of inflating these sorts of things in the public mind and the public perception, even if the facts are not squaring with what they're saying. This is probably something that free societies have not quite figured out in a way we need to yet.
I would like to touch upon also on one negative tendency in democratic countries, which is decline in trust of institutions, which is visible in many different kind of Western countries. We also see sharp polarization in societies. So Mr. Walker as well as Mr. Shekhovtsov, how to deal with that and why do we see the decline of trust? Because that undermines the core premises of democratic institutions themselves.
So I don't think there's a quick or simple answer to this. I think just speaking for a number of countries I observe, including the United States, clearly over a period of time, there have been a number of factors ranging from the way in which we apportion and redesign our political map every 10 years for our House of Representatives and state legislatures, but also the media and the evolution of the way in which people consume information, including but not limited to the way social media has evolved, absolutely has stimulated more polarization by sorting people out, by feeding them what they want, by, in essence, pushing people in certain directions, often towards the ends of the spectrum. That's going to require some serious reform, one way or another. On the one hand, society is trying to grapple with this in a variety of ways, and I think we're making some strides, but it's very, very difficult for any given citizen to have the burden of figuring out how to manage these very potent and even revolutionary technologies. There needs to be reform that occurs in democratic societies of all stripe, including in the US, that will not encourage the worst impulses in terms of people's behavior, the choices they make, and we're not there yet.
Yeah.
I would agree that the social media is playing a role in shrinking of the democratic space at the moment. Because in the end, social media allowed every voice across the world to be heard. And then talking about the declining trust in institutions, I think one of the sources for this is that all those individual voices, their value became almost the same as the value of organizations or groups or communities. All these horizontal networking and empowering every voice, whatever their ideological stance or any other stance is, including some extreme ideologies, including even open hatred and open attempts to undermine liberal democracy, undermine the foundations of the space that they're using. So I think in the end, because empowering every voice, every single voice, it happens at the expense of the democratic space, of the liberal democratic space. It is shrinking. And I think the social media and the model itself, the technicalities of the social media, they push people to sometimes adopt really polarizing opinions where no debate is possible.
And very briefly at the end, the conference, the Future of Democracy conference, gathered a lot of decision makers. So what would you advise them to tackle this particular issue that we've been discussing, polarization and lack of trust in democratic institutions? Dr. Shekhovtsov?
Let me just say this, is that we need to be prepared, we need to get prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. And the challenge one of the major challenges of tomorrow, in my opinion, is the upcoming fourth industrial revolution, where we will see the integration of the physical, biological, and digital. And we have actually we don't have many ideas how to deal with this new challenge, because we don't know what it will be about, how artificial intelligence being used on the industrial scale, how it will change our societies. We don't know what will be considered as human in, say, 10, 15 years with gene editing, for example. We need to get prepared for what is coming, for the era of deep fakes, where we will no longer be able, probably, to prove some facts by, say, video footage, which can be easily manipulated by authoritarian regimes or even some corrupt democratic regimes. We need to get prepared for this meteoric rise of technology.
Yeah. So, Walker?
I think this conference is very well organized, both governments and non-governmental participants, which in the future, and I think as Anton suggests, we're going to need new forms of collaboration that can accelerate our learning and devise innovative responses to these enormous challenges. The polarization challenge has been with us now for some time, a lot of that coming from the media space that we're still grappling with. But I think as Anton properly asserts, going forward, we're going to have these challenges and so many more that in the absence of certainly free societies, institutions collaborating, cooperating more purposefully, we'll be hard-pressed to meet these challenges in a way that will be adequate.
Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion, and thank you all for those who were watching us throughout the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.